She had scrubbed the marble of his study for years, polished the silver, arranged the flowers the way he liked them, and never imagined the day she would stand frozen in front of a portrait and hear something rise inside her that had waited for years. The portrait hung on the wall above the fireplace, lit by a soft lamp that made the oil paint shimmer. It showed a young man in a dark suit, eyes steady, chin lifted in a practiced expression of quiet confidence. A faint scar twitched at the corner of his mouth like a memory. Guests admired the painting and murmured about family lineage and legacy as they passed. None of them paused the way she did. She felt the breath catch in her chest as if the past and present had collided. Her hands, still wet from dishwater pressure, reached instinctively to steady herself against the mantel. The maid who had cleaned that house for over a decade could not have guessed that a single stroke of paint would pull her back to a small room with cracked windows and peeling wallpaper, to a narrow cot, to a boy with holes in his shoes and a laugh that rose like a bright flame. She had told herself 100 times that those years were behind her, that life was about moving forward. She had never told anyone about the nights she had slipped bread to a boy who would not stop talking about sky lanterns and cities with bridges that glittered like new coins. She had never told anyone about the promise he made to her when the orphanage needed money to fix the heating, and he had, with the childish solemnity only a child could muster, said he would become somebody important and come back for them. Her mouth opened before her mind could stop it. The words came out like a shout that startled the room into silence. "Sir, this boy lived with me in the orphanage." The hush that followed was immediate. Conversations faltered. Crystal goblets stopped halfway to lips. The people in the room turned toward her as if the sound had been a bell. The owner of this house, the man whose life her hands had tended to like a ritual, lifted the teacup and stared. No one expected her voice to be the one to break the murmurs. She could see the surprise on his face transform into something else. He moved closer to the portrait, as if proximity could conjure the memory of the brush and the sitter. His jaw tightened, curiosity laced with a strange unease. For a heartbeat he looked at her the way people look at someone who speaks a language they only half understand. The boy in the portrait had been his boy for so many. He had been the heir apparent, a cousin perhaps, or a ward placed under the care of the family after some private tragedy. Names mattered very little to the guests, who cared more for the story the portrait represented: continuity, reputation, lineage. But to her the portrait was a living archive of laughter and scraped knees, of nights when they traded stories under a threadbare blanket until the lights in the orphanage dorm went out. She watched as recognition slipped across his face like a slow illumination. He squinted, turned to the maid whose job it had been to make the bed by the guest rooms immaculate, and to fold napkins into precise rectangles. The man in the suit, impeccable even in paint, took a step back. The moment stretched. "Your voice trembled when you said it," he said, trying to catch the name that now floated like a ghost. "Who is he?" She swallowed. Her throat felt dry. There was a name and it tasted like a coin turned cold. She had been careful with names in that place. Names could be stolen, could be used to rewrite stories, but when the painted eyes met hers across the room like a familiar private code, there was no more room for silence. "His name was Jonah," she said. "Jonah Cole." There was a stillness like snow at dawn. The owner's expression broke in the way of someone who had seen a rumor become fact. Jonah Cole. The name landed in the room and ricocheted against chandeliers. Jonah Cole had been a boy the orphanage whispered about, a kid with a stubborn edge and a bright grin. He had left the orphanage at 18 with a battered suitcase and an old photograph pinned inside. People at the shelter said he had gone to the city to make something of himself. She had watched him go with a small, fiercely protective hope, the hope of someone who had given away a piece of herself to a child and trusted he would carry it. Later that night, the house emptied of guests, and the mantel light dimmed. He called her into the study. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and old books. The man who kept her employment folded his hands on the desk like a judge preparing to weigh testimony. Her palms were still damp from work. She kept them folded in front of her because she had learned to keep her hands where they could be seen. "Tell me everything," he said simply. She told him about cardboard beds and toothbrushes shared like treasure. She told him about late-night whispers when the wind howled and the old radiators clanked like tired giants. She told him about Jonah's insistence on sweeping the floor before breakfast, about how he had a habit of folding his food wrappers into tiny boats and lining them up on the windowsill like a naval fleet. She described the scar at his mouth from a fall off the orphanage roof when he was 12, and how he had kissed his sister's forehead like an apology for the world. As she spoke, the man's eyes did not leave the portrait. "Sometimes a person can be sketched into the bone of a face," she said. "That portrait is more than paint. It is a map with roads that lead to an old truth." He listened with the silent patience of someone who had wealth enough to afford it and curiosity enough to spend it. When she finished, he sat back, and the leather chair sighed under him. "How do you know it is the same boy?" he asked. "There are many who might have a similar look." "I know because of the scar," she said. "I know because of his laugh that never left his throat. I know because he hummed lullabies backwards when he thought no one heard him. I know because he promised to come back. And because when I met his eyes in that painting I felt the whole room tilt like a ship." The man considered this. There was a quiet in which some private reckoning took place. He had inherited much, and had lost a few pieces along the way. The walls of his home did not offer him more truth than the stories of the small, ordinary people who had kept watch over his life in quiet ways. "You remember his family?" he asked. She hesitated. "In the stories told inside the orphanage, there were things you guarded and things you offered. Names of those who had been kind, names of those who had been cruel." Jonah's family had been a rumor and a photograph. He had no family to claim him except the dorm and the dozen souls who shared its corners. He paused and then asked the question that changed the course of the room. "Would you like to see him again?" Her heart made a small, ridiculous leap. See him again. Those words spiraled into visions. A grown man, perhaps successful, perhaps still a dreamer, standing across from her not as a boy asking for quarters, but as a person who had carved his path with long nights and decisions. She had been careful not to expect. But that small possibility felt like sunshine. "Yes," she said. "So we will find him," he said, and he meant it. The next days turned into a quiet search that used the house's resources and the maid's memories. They began with the photograph Jonah had carried when he left. It was a cheap snapshot of a summer fair, of a boy with smeared cotton candy and a grin too big for his face. They compared it to the portrait, to interviews, to records. The house had ways of tracking histories that the orphanage could not imagine. People there moved with files and clerks, and a small, efficient net of private investigators who worked evenings so their inquiries could be discreet. When they reached Jonah in a small office downtown, he did not look surprised to be recognized. Years had taught him how to live with recognition and suspicion. His life had been made of hard decisions and late hours. He had answers on his face the way his shoulders carried the proof of storms weathered. The reunion was not one of the melodramatic types seen in movies. It was a slow, awkward choreography of recognition. She stood in the back of the room as he and the gentleman from the house exchanged measured words. When Jonah walked into the sunlit lobby of that office, his eyes were steady but wary. He saw her, and for a moment the city noise receded like tide. She stepped forward. He stopped as if a string had been pulled taut between them. The years fell away, and she wanted to touch the scar on his mouth like pressing a fingertip to a stone to make sure it was real. He had grown into broad shoulders and a quiet manner. His hands bore the marks of work and worry. There was a dignity about him that had been there even when his coat was threadbare. "You remember me," she said, though she hardly believed that voice which had broken and softened with time. "I remember you," he replied. "You smelled of lemon oil and soap, and you always had a way with the youngest ones. You taught me to fold food wrappers into tiny boats." He smiled, and the room seemed to breathe. There was so much to say and so much to leave unsaid. He spoke of nights when decisions had been sharp and the city had roared around him. He spoke of a job that had carved out his hours, of a scholarship that had changed the angle of his life, and of a door that had opened because he had knocked long enough. He never spoke with pity. He spoke with respect that made her chest thrum. "You came back," she said, remembering the promise he had made at a time when promises were brittle with the wind. "I kept it," he said. "I kept as many as I could." The man from the house watched. The relationship between the three of them shifted into a new geometry, one that carried acknowledgement and decision. The gentleman who had employed her had not only been moved but also quietly disquieted. He had a portrait to reconcile with the person who might have been the subject, and that entailed rethinking how lives were categorized on the walls. That night, there was a small dinner where the three of them sat together. It was not a celebration so much as a careful gathering. Food was set without ceremony beyond the necessary. Conversation flowed from childhood recollections into practicalities. Jonah asked about the orphanage and how it had fared, and she spoke passionately about the little things that made the place live and breathe. He listened and then made a suggestion. "They are short of funds for the heating system," he said. "I can help." He offered not a grand pronouncement but a practical plan: immediate repairs, a fund to support education, a partnership with local clinics to ensure medical care. He spoke as someone who had navigated grant forms and board meetings, as someone who had the acumen to take ideas and shape them into action. She listened, incredulous and grateful. Tears rose, but she blinked them away because she had learned to keep her face calm in front of those she served. The house owner nodded. "I will support that," he said. "It is time the world paid back what it can." Word of the reunion traveled through the small circles the way good weather spreads, quietly and then all at once. Former staff at the orphanage heard. The kids who had graduated learned that Jonah had returned. There was something like a soft triumph in the air, a feeling that a promise had been honored. But not everyone greeted the news with warmth. Old records sometimes held surprises, somewhere between the lines, of job applications and a list of benefactors. There were ties and claims that complicated what seemed simple. A woman who had fostered another boy from the same shelter felt a stir of jealousy, a distant relative who had once had interest in. The painting felt threatened by the reappearance of the subject. Small resentments grew teeth. One morning a letter arrived that suggested the portrait was not painted from life but was a commissioned image meant to present a certain family narrative. The letter implied that the man in the portrait had been chosen to represent a lineage carefully curated for reputation. It made the reunion less simple and more politically charged. When she heard about the letter, she felt the old familiar prick of fear. In shelters, reputations could be weaponized, names could be used to justify actions that were cruel. She feared Jonah would become a pawn in arguments he never asked to join. She feared the sanctity of the promise would be measured in columns of ink and legal language. Jonah, however, stood steady. He had come back not to fight with ghosts, but to correct what he could. He went to the orphanage and listened to the board. He sat with the kids and let them tell him stories of scraped knees and impossible dreams. He did not speak about wealth as a showy change. He introduced plans and then withdrew to let them breathe and develop. One afternoon, several months after the first meeting, he took a photograph down from a wall in the orphanage. It was a picture of the backyard where children had once chased each other and where the paint had peeled in long, friendly tabs. He knelt and painted a new swing with his hands in the dirt, imagining a place where laughter could be loud without apology. The old caretaker, who had watched the orphanage for decades, stood by and nodded approval. There were challenges. Donors sent letters with conditions. People with good intentions offered help wrapped in strings that the staff had to untie, and there were bureaucratic snares that ate at plans. But under his care, the place gained a kind of stability that had been missing. He insisted on transparency and offered internships for older kids so they could learn trades. He visited regularly and sometimes sat in the back corner when stories were told, letting memories heal in the mundane work of being present. Through all this, the maid found her life altered in ways that were subtle and profound. She had always been industrious, proud of the way a clean room could make a person feel seen. But Jonah's return shifted how she thought about the future. No longer did she fold napkins alone without wondering who would fold memories into newer shapes. She began to save a small amount from her wages, imagining a future where she could travel back to the neighborhood, where the orphanage stood, and walk without haste. Her son, who had left for college and who had felt embarrassed by her job at times, noticed the change in her. He began to listen more. She found that the dignity in her work rubbed off in small ways on those around her. Her employer, once simply the man in the suit who paid her wages, became an ally for causes that mattered to her. One winter evening, Jonah arranged a modest ceremony at the orphanage. He had invited the board, a few donors, and the children. He spoke without flourish. "I did not do this alone," he said. "I did it because someone believed in me when I was small enough to fit in a single bed." He stopped and looked over at her, and the room responded as if to a conductor's cue. There were clapping hands that started quiet and swelled into genuine applause. After the ceremony, the photographer caught a moment that would later be used in pamphlets and on the homepage for the shelter. The photo showed Jonah standing with a clipboard, children around him, and her in the foreground with her hands clasped. She did not pose. The image caught the way she stood, strong and steady, and later she felt uneasy at the attention. She had never sought recognition, but she accepted the moment because it had the weight of truth. There were still whispers. A few spoke of opportunism, suggesting a poor woman had come out of the woodwork to claim a connection. Others tried to read motives into every gesture. She ignored most of it. She had learned that the only opinion that mattered in the small hours of the night was the one she carried in her own chest. Over time, Jonah's presence brought subtle shifts to the house where the portrait had hung for years. The owner, who once saw life as a series of events to catalog, began to fund causes and stay late in the office to read reports. Small changes like better heating for the shelter and a scholarship fund for the children became ordinary. The portrait remained above the fireplace, but its meaning had changed. No longer was it just an emblem of status. It hummed with story, with the weight of real promises kept. One afternoon, after a charity dinner, she sat alone in the study and looked at the portrait. The painting looked back at her with its carefully rendered certainty. She thought of the boy who had been so certain of skylines and lanterns, of the bargains a child makes with the future. She thought of how fragile such bargains can be and how rare it is for them to be honored. It occurred to her, with a slow delight and no small surprise, that the portrait had always been more than a face. It had been a touchstone for a life she had helped shape without thinking of herself as part of that shaping. She had been the quiet force that taught a boy to fold his lunch wrappers into ships, to stand up for the younger ones, to laugh so loud in the face of cold nights that warmth seemed to be a choice. She drifted to the window and watched the neighborhood go by. There were children playing, some of them from the shelter, their sneakers bright against the pavement. She pressed her forehead to the glass and closed her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she felt there was room enough in the world for both service and recognition, for loyalty and for being seen. In the days that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. The portrait stayed where it was, but whenever she passed the study, she felt a secret smile tug at her mouth. Jonah visited occasionally, and each time he greeted her with the old private jokes they had once shared. He would sometimes bring a small present for the orphanage, a book, a tool, a packet of seeds. Once he surprised the children with a day trip to the river, teaching them how to fold real boats and then letting the ones that flew sink and the ones that held hold steady. Years later, when the house owner passed and the portrait was moved to a new home, the painting still carried its shadow of a story. The new owner, who had read the shelter's newsletter, knew the true history. He placed the portrait with care, and the plaque beneath it bore not only a name but a simple line that told of an origin, raised at St. Jude's orphanage, and returned as a benefactor. When she learned about the plaque, she felt a warmth that settled like a hand on her back. The plaque did not change who she was, but it altered the public record, giving the truth a place on the wall so that the story could not be rewritten by rumor or greed. At the end of her life, people who knew her often spoke about the way she had carried stories without making them into trophies. They remembered the quiet way she had held a young boy's promise like a secret. Jonah often came to visit, older now, with a gentle salt and pepper at his temples. He would sit with her in the sun and listen as she spoke about small things the same way she had always done, with attention and care. "You saved me more than once," he said in the twilight of a long friendship. "You did more than I could have asked," she replied. "You kept a promise." And that was the truth of it. The world sometimes was loud enough to drown out the small, steady voices that held a life together. But if one listened carefully, one could hear the rustle of those voices turning into the chorus of things done and promises kept. The maid who had shouted a name in a room of glass and silver had opened a door not just for a boy, but for a whole circle of lives that needed tending. Her hands, which had spent decades cleaning houses and folding napkins, lay in her lap like proof. She had not been invisible. She had been the hinge that allowed a future to swing open, and when the portrait was shown to a new generation, it no longer represented a distant wealth but a lineage of kindness and the stubborn, ordinary work of keeping a promise.